Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 212. This week the questions are taken from Guide 256, that's the guide to the Imperial Japanese Navy's vessel Kotetsugu - CSS Stonewall - about 5 dozen other names, and the Wednesday video on the Age of Sail gunnery, particularly the lethality of splinters, featuring the Vasa Museum and the wonderful Dr. Fred Hocker, who is of course the curator there. Pakome Carden asks, given their general design preferences and tendencies to experiment and tweak, as well as their strategic requirements, if the French had been prescient and rich enough to build a few carriers in the 1930s, what do you think they might have looked like? Well, it is rather difficult to work out because whilst the French were designing a lot of ships that ended up not being built mostly as design studies during the early 1930s, carriers weren't really among them. But if they had decided at some point in the early to mid-1930s to go with building an aircraft carrier, then I suspect one of the easiest ways of doing so would have been to use the Dunkirk class as a basis and work from there, because it's already a fast hull, and they're not having to do a full conversion, but it's quite informative to look at the percentage weight reductions when carriers are converted from battleships to give you some idea of how much the displacement might change. As I said, obviously they're not converting them from a pre-built vessel, but then again, a lot of the conversions weren't actually fully built as capital ships before they were converted either. But nonetheless, if you compare a Cargi, Karga, Lexington and Eagle, not including Courageous, Glorious and Furious, because they are rather odd fish in that they basically didn't have any armour to lose. But when you look at those first four, and then you average out the percentage difference between their displacement as designed as gun capital ships and their displacement as carriers, it comes out to about an 83% of the originally designed displacement, which if you apply that to Dunkirk or Strasbourg, comes in at if you were to convert them straight off, in theory you'd have a ship of between 21 and 22,000 tons. Now that is a little bit below the displacement limits of the naval treaties in place at the time. And, of course, they could make efficiencies by starting with the hull as a basis, but not having to, actually do full physical conversion work. So if they'd done that, I suspect the easiest way to get up to a 23,000-ton displacement as is compliant with the Second London Naval Treaty would have been just to extend the hull a little bit, and then obviously, put the hangars and flight decks, etc. on. So it would allow for economies, which obviously the French would still want to observe because they can reuse the machinery, the power plant, a lot of the existing manufacturing capability that exists for the Dunkirk and Strasbourg hulls. And so, overall you probably end up with a carrier that's probably about 720 to 750 foot at the waterline, easily capable of north of 30 knots, probably capable of carrying 60 aircraft or so, and a few spares, 50 to 60 depending on the strike loadout. Now admittedly this is a somewhat larger carrier than the Joffre class, which they historically would start to build in the latter part of the 1930s, but you said that in this particular scenario the French have some money, so why not? Robert Caslow asks, did you see the Mythbusters episode where they tested this, that being splinters, out, and the test showed the splinters were exaggerated? In the nicest way, yes I did, and in the nicest way I did kind of address this in the video as well. But to sum it up for those of you who might not have had a chance to see that video, it came out a while ago, there's quite a lot of things that are a problem with the Mythbusters test. Primarily the fact they used a very small cannon, Civil War era one, single-digit pound weight of shot, not a 24 or 32 pounder, and also the replica they had of the side of the ship was not actually the replica of a side of the ship of the line. I mean, it was basically again, without trying to be too harsh, it was a particularly sturdy fence panel with a whole gun port cut in it. And that's about the best you could say for it. Now, to be fair, to be completely fair, a few other comments did raise the issue that apparently Adam Savage has said subsequently that they did want to do a full-up test with a full-on, 24, 32-pounder naval gun, etc., but insurances and permissions, etc., they weren't able to do so, which, okay, fine, that's an explanation, but it doesn't change the fact that the test that was actually run with the target they actually used is completely, or near enough as makes no difference, completely invalid when it comes to actual, ships in combat. And the tests that Dr. Hocker was part of are far more precise and far more realistic. And as I pointed out in the video, something else that they didn't address was this shot from above. You see that massive bit of planking? Pretty sure that's gonna hurt, and that didn't get covered in the Mythbusters test, but that's a big bit of wood to be suddenly flung in your face. JC 622 Kilo 57J, alright, says, assuming a surprise attack in foggy conditions, would it have been possible for a 32-gun armed merchant ship, assuming armed with a majority 24-pounders or better, would it have been able to cause enough casualties and damage to a first-rate ship of the line with a raking broadside up through the stern in order to enable a boarding action? Basically, could the Black Pearl have successfully ambushed HMS Dauntless in the opening scene of Pirates of the Caribbean in the same way that Surprise and Acheron ambushed each other in the beginning and end of Master and Commander? Okay, so there's a few things here. First, 32-gun armed merchant ship, you're very unlikely to find one. They did exist occasionally, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule. And secondly, they're definitely not going to be armed with the majority 24-pounder main battery. A 32-gun ship that has 24-pounders as its main battery is a heavy frigate. At that, probably a large fifth rate. Nevertheless, assuming the notion of some kind of ship armed with a mainly 24-pounder gun deck and carrying 32 guns, whatever it happens to exactly be, raking a first rate to cause enough damage to enable a boarding action, no. Basically, Victory, being a 104-gunner ship, executed what's almost the perfect raking broadside against Bu Centaur, which was a third rate, so a much smaller vessel. So Victory had a significant firepower advantage, obviously using 32-pounders and 24-pounders and all the rest, and the 68-pound carronade. And although it crippled Bu Centaur, it didn't knock Bu Centaur out of the fight entirely. Now, could Victory have then boarded Bu Centaur? Possibly, but the big problem with the scenario presented in the question is the specification of a merchant ship, because even if you got the ideal possible raking broadside, yes, you might cause several hundred casualties, but a first rate is going to have 700, 800, 900 crew. So even if you kill 50 to 100 and wound 100 to 200 people, your merchant ship still has less than 30 crew on it, which means there's still more than 10 times that many uninjured crew on the first rate, and the first rate's bigger than you, so you're going to have to, climb up with your 2 dozen strong boarding party and hope that you are capable of taking on 20 to 1 odds when those people have the defensive advantage. So yeah, that's unfortunately not going to happen. If you were lucky, then that kind of broadside, not if you wanted to attack the ship, but if you wanted to at least escape it, if you were lucky, that broadside might smash the steering arrangements for the ship and render it out of control, which will give you enough time to run away, but that's about the best you can hope for. Goblin Stomper asks, can you recommend a source for maritime traditions and customs? Well, there's this one, Traditions of the Navy, a collection of naval customs, terms and traditions. There's also another similarly titled book, Naval Customs and Traditions by Gerard Wells. Now, both of these are early, first part of the 20th century publications, but to be honest, most of the stuff I suspect you're asking about well predates either book. So both of those are available both second-hand and actually had recent print runs as well, hence my choice of those two. The other thing, if you go to the channel homepage, my channel homepage, and then look for playlists and look for recommended viewing, I have a couple of playlists that aren't made up of, well, one of them's partially made up of my videos, the other one isn't. So one playlist is collaborations. That's basically as the name suggests, a list of all I think most of the videos I've appeared in collaborating with other people, a lot of which aren't actually hosted on the channel. But there's also a recommended viewing, and those are videos that have nothing to do with me, but I think are definitely worth watching for those of you who are interested. And the first video on that list should be one on World War II TV, featuring obviously Paul the host and Kate Jameson, and she's talking about Royal Navy traditions and customs, which she is an expert in amongst other things, and that's definitely worth a good listen. Cap198462 asks, this gives me the opportunity to ask, as an engineer, with enough data collected from the Mythbusters test or similar ones, can't you just scale it up mathematically and get an answer for any size gun you want? Yes and no. So some tests can be scaled directly. Other tests can be scaled, but you need to impart a scaling factor or equation to account for differences in the results at different sizes. And some tests, it's just not physically possible to scale, especially if you're using different scales of tests for different purposes, or different scales of object within a given test. And this basically relies on what exactly is it that you're testing. So, for example, you can see here Froude's tank. Now, scale model testing of hull forms is definitely something that can be done. And then you can apply the lessons learned from your scale model all the way up to a full-size hull. However, when you're making the actual test hull, you will find that certainly in the time of Froude, they would make it out of wood with a little bit of additional weight to make sure it sits at the right point in the water that was inserted. Nowadays you can make it out of all sorts of materials, obviously, but the one thing they weren't doing was making a perfectly scale hull with respect to hull thicknesses and so forth. And that's simply because of the square cube law, volume versus area. This makes a huge problem when it comes to scaling tests generally, because the two things increase and decrease at different rates because of said square cube law. Now, that sometimes on a very macro scale can be overcome, but when you're talking about significant differences in size, then you have some fairly severe problems, because the behaviors of certain things and the properties of certain objects can be rather materially different at very different scales. For example, if you were to make say a 1:350 battleship hull, and you were going to test it in water for something like, say, a Froude tank test, if you had a battleship which, say, the hull plates were 1 inch thick, not including the armour plates, obviously, and you made a 1:350 scale model of it, you would basically be making the sides out of particularly thick aluminium foil, which, well, so I guess you could use steel foil, but the thickness would be the thickness of like 3 sheets of aluminium foil. And you can imagine the problems there. It's not going to have any real rigidity, and therefore its behaviour in the water is going to be completely out of whack. Likewise, a lot of things to do with pressure, because you have standard atmospheric pressure. If you are testing explosives and other things like that, then testing very small amounts that generate very small differences in pressure can give you completely different results to what a full-scale test would actually do, simply because of the influence of the atmosphere. And we've gone over a couple of times in various drydocks why, for example, the idea of suction when a ship sinks cannot realistically be tested at a small scale if what you're looking for is, enough force to suck a person down. You can, if you do the scale test correctly, do such a test to demonstrate that suction exists, but again, the square cube law comes into play, and the force that would exert increases exponentially with the displacement of the ship that's sinking. And so a small scale test, if what you're looking for is on the scale test, does it suck somebody down or does it suck an object down, you're not going to get the answer that would happen on a larger scale, partly because the force is relatively weak, and then that's coupled with the fact that the buoyancy of the objects that you're using probably is pretty much the same as they would be on any scale, because buoyancy is a factor of density, and therefore buoyancy doesn't have a scale. A 10 centimeter cube of polystyrene has exactly the same buoyancy properties as a 10 meter cube of polystyrene, and therefore this is where you get factors that are out of scale with each other, and then it doesn't work. And likewise, one of the reasons I'm slightly leery of the Italian tests on the Littorio's armour scheme in terms of the decapping plate, etc., which were conducted before the war, was because they used a smaller shell against a full-scale armour section in order to see if the decapping worked. But whilst you can use a scale shell to impart the same kind of kinetic energy, basically just by changing the amount of propellant that you're using to give a certain striking velocity, because of course kinetic energy is half mv squared. So that's something that you can scale to a certain degree. You start to reach material limit properties with smaller shells, but regardless. But when it comes to whether or not a shell is decapped, that is something where the distance between the decapping plate and the main armour is directly proportional, if you want it to succeed, to the calibre of the shell that has been fired. And if you have a full-scale armour piece, then if you fire what's effectively a sub-calibre shell, you're getting an artificially large ratio between the calibre of the shell that's hitting and the void space that's being created, and therefore you'll get an artificially favourable result. And then, of course, you've got other issues about, the filling in between the two bits of armour in that particular test, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, that test was flawed in that they used a sub-calibre shell. If they wanted to get a accurate result of what would happen, then they should have used a full 15-inch shell. The fact that they didn't means there will always be a little bit of a question over the effectiveness of the Littorio's armour scheme. And of course, you also have to do the test properly in the first place, which is why you can't scale up from the Mythbusters test, because the physical effects that the impact of a cannonball has on a ship's side, if you had said, okay, well, we have a 9-pounder gun, and we want to replicate the effect of a 24-pounder, roughly speaking, 2.5 times the size. Okay, to a certain extent, if you had built a 2.5 times scaled down ship of the line side replica, there may be some merit to the experiment. There are a number of other factors, however, which would rule that out somewhat as a viable method. But you could do it, and it would be a much closer approximation. But you have to have that scaled ship side as well. The main problem with those kind of tests when you're scaling them is people looking for full-scale results on part-scale testing. So even if you had your 9-pounder gun with your 2.5 times scaled down ship side, I suspect that what everyone would be looking for would be lethal splinters. And if they didn't get them, they say, oh, well, it obviously isn't a problem, but they're forgetting that the lethality effects have been dialed down as well by at least a factor of 2.5. And I say there's a whole other range of factors, which is why you wouldn't really want to do a test like that at those kinds of scales, but that would be kind of your minimum floor of entry. You'd actually have to measure to be even close to useful, you'd have to measure the force of impact of the various splinters and then start to scale it up again by a number of different factors, and it would be more than just 2.5. But anyway, so hopefully that illustrates why scaling tests can be very problematic unless you are very, very careful about analysing what your input and output factors are actually going to be. HMS King George V asks, I've noticed that some sources covering the belt and deck thickness of the King George V class differ on what base stats they use, 15 inch versus 14.7 for the belt and 6 or 5.8 for the deck. I know armour will be close but not exact when made, but I don't think this explains why some books differ about this. So, I have covered this in a previous Drydock or two, but it does bear a brief recap. Essentially, the problem lies in how you interpret the baseline sources. Now, obviously you'd think 15-inch belt is a 15-inch belt is a 15-inch belt. However, because obviously you need to calculate the displacement of a vessel in order to, especially for the treaty system, but more generally to ensure it's going to float at the right level, etc., etc., they tended, at least in Britain, to measure plate by weight. So it would be, I believe it was something like 40 pounds to the inch over a given area. So you'd have a 40-pound plate, I think it was per square foot. A 40-pound plate would be 1 square foot of metal that was 1 inch thick. Now, as it turns out, the density of steel is just a little bit higher than that rule of thumb suggests. So if you did, in fact, make a 1 foot by 1 foot sheet of iron that happened to weigh exactly 40 pounds, it would actually be just a fraction thinner than 1 inch. And so if you specify your belt armour as so many 100-pound plate, then that's going to correspond at 40 pounds per inch thickness to a certain number of inches. But if it's manufactured to that tolerance, then you're going to gradually end up with the thickness actually being less than what you wanted. And this difference between the actual density of steel and the rule of thumb density of steel that was spec'd is the difference. Now, the reason why some sources say 15 and 6 or 14.7 and 5.8 is because, unhelpfully, the British ships covers and other specifications for the early part of the 20th century use both terms interchangeably. And that includes when it comes to ordering the armour from manufacturers. So at times they'll talk about a 15-inch belt, and at other times they'll talk about a plate of 600 pounds per square foot, which is entirely unhelpful. And then you also have to throw in the manufacturing tolerances, which could be, well, in the US, for example, manufacturing tolerances were accepted with a variance of up to 1/4 of an inch. That's US tolerances, though not British tolerances, but the fact that those were the accepted tolerances suggests that also manufacturers could be out by even more than that. And then they'd have to, well, either do a different plate if it came out far too thin, or grind down a plate that was far too thick. So as far as I'm aware, unless somebody wants to go and fish something up from Prince of Wales, which of course is going to be rusted to heck and back, you're not really going to be able to tell exactly what the thickness of the plating was, because one, I don't think it's entirely possible to prove for absolute certainty whether the armour manufacturers for the King George V's were following a document that said we want 15-inch thick belt armour, or a document that said we want 600-pound weight belt armour, and which of the two they therefore then followed. And even so, regardless of which one that they followed, what were the manufacturing tolerances, how tight to them were they, and which side of those tolerances did any given manufacturer err on. So if we assume, for the sake of argument, that the Royal Navy had the same 1/4 inch plus minus tolerance that the US Navy did, then you could construct a, if you like, best case scenario, at least in terms of protection for the Royal Navy, wherein the manufacturer receives an order that specifies 15-inch thickness. So they make a 15-inch belt, but with a 1/4 inch tolerance, and they go a bit OTT, they grind it down a little bit. So in that case, you could have a belt that's 15.25 inches thick, or you could have another scenario in which the manufacturer receives order that says we want a 600-pound plate, so he manufactures that to 14.7 inches, but perhaps he's skimping down a little bit, and again, was assuming a US-style quarter-inch tolerance, he might actually end up, therefore, making a plate that's just under 14.5 inches thick. So your best and worst case scenario, there's about 3/4 of an inch between the two for a King George V class plate. The answer is probably somewhere vaguely in the middle, but without exhaustively poring over the records, if they even still exist, for the various manufacturers who made the armour plate for the King George V and exactly what the plates were measured and weighed at, we can't tell for precise certainty, other than the King George V had a protection somewhere in the vicinity of 15 inches, give or take. Josh Thomas Moore asks, did the Polish Navy ever have plans to make coastal battleships like the Finnish Ilmarinen? And how would the Ilmarinen have in battle against the pre-dreadnought Schleswig-Holstein? So, as far as I'm aware, the Polish Navy didn't have any coastal battleship plans. The Polish Navy in the interwar period at first was focused on getting ships at all, which meant ordering destroyers, etc., from overseas, but they were also very focused on building up their own capability, their own shipbuilding capability, which makes sense. However, that shipbuilding capability had only gotten to the point where they could make torpedo boats, mine layers, and just about getting started on destroyers by the time World War II kicked off. So there was no way they had the capability to build even a 3,500-4,000 ton coastal defence ship like Ilmarinen. It just wasn't within the purview of their own building capabilities. In theory, they could have ordered from elsewhere, but they don't seem to have shown much interest in doing so. Now, as far as Ilmarinen herself, if she'd gone up against Schleswig-Holstein, I don't think she would have done particularly well on her own in a straight-up fight in the open ocean. Now, that is somewhat different to if she'd got to pick the battlefield, i.e. if she'd been fighting off of the Finnish coast, where she might have considerably more of an advantage. But although their main batteries are notionally close, Schleswig-Holstein is so much bigger, so it can take more punishment. It also has more protection, so it's able to, take hits at longer ranges. And assuming that the fire control systems are of similar effectiveness, Schleswig-Holstein's also a little bit faster. So Schleswig-Holstein can, in an open ocean engagement, dictate the battle. It can just generally absorb hits to non-critical areas somewhat better than the much, much smaller coastal defence ship. And in the event of a hit on the armour, Schleswig-Holstein is somewhat better equipped to take that hit than Ilmarinen is. So, open ocean, it's Schleswig-Holstein's fight to lose. Of course, not accounting for the random variable factor that is the lucky hit, but Ilmarinen wouldn't fight Schleswig-Holstein on the open ocean. She'd fight the German ship in and around the Finnish island archipelagos, and that might tip the balance its way. But, in pure ship versus ship terms, the German ship has an advantage. Atomic Babel asks, a drydock question on drydocks. When and why did drydock sides go from stepped to slab-sided, and what was the advantage of either? Well, it's a little bit of an open-ended question, because technically speaking, there are still drydocks that have been built in the last 30, 40 years that have steps, and there are drydocks that were manufactured 60, 80, 100 years ago that have slab sides. Although, admittedly, it is trending more towards slab sides these days. But regardless, the reason for the change, obviously floating drydocks tend to be slab-sided, but the reason for physical drydocks, the change is basically a combination of a change of building material, now that large amounts of steel are also available, as well as reinforced concrete, as opposed to the older stone and concrete, and then early reinforced concrete, I suppose. Plus also the method of construction, as I say, has changed. Powered excavating machines make it much, much easier to dig out large volumes than it used to be, which is a key thing, because obviously if you are relying on manpower or early machinery, you don't want to excavate any more than you absolutely have to. And if you take into account the fact that a lot of ships, especially in older times, tended to have a far more sloping underwater profile than especially some modern ships whose central cross sections can basically look square, you didn't need that wide a base of your dry dock, albeit, when you're talking about capital ships, they could be fairly square in profile through the central sections. But nevertheless, it's a combination set of construction materials, construction equipment, and available area, which is another thing, because if you have a relatively small available area, then you want a vertical dock in order to maximize the use of that. Whereas if you've got tons of space, you can have a stepped one. A stepped one is, and this is where we get into the pros and cons, a stepped dry dock, as I said, requires you to excavate slightly less volume for a given ship capacity, but it is also more structurally stable, because the sides are considerably stabler. It also means for a given upper level surface area, you have to pump out less water and pump in less water to get a ship to float, because obviously there's a good chunk of what would notionally be the cubic volume taken up by the steps. It also gives you positions from which to prop a ship if you need to. You remember a lot of the older pictures of dry docks, you see ships propped with large poles that are basically wedged into these steps. Those steps also give a platform from which you can more easily access certain elements of a ship that fits comfortably into the entire dock. Whereas the slab-sided one obviously is a simpler design. You have to go pretty much with slab-sided if you want a floating dry dock that can be raised and lowered. As I said, for given accommodation space, they take up less surface area. And conversely, for the same surface area, you can fit in a considerably larger ship. And then, of course, you also have hybrid things. So if you look at some of the very, very largest dry docks that are around these days, while some of them are slab-sided and one or two of them are stepped, there's also this kind of in-between where some of them have, generally speaking, a slab-sided appearance, but if you look more closely, you'll notice there's a very small amount of stepping, again, for structural stability. And the other big elephant in the room is how stable is the land around where you're building the dry dock, because if it's fairly solid, fairly stable, not really going to move very much, a slab-sided dry dock is probably the better option, especially these days. Whereas if you're less confident about the stability of the surrounding land in the long term, you probably want a stepped one. Jake Miller asks, what contemporary ironclads could CSS Stonewall Japanese Katetsu realistically beat in battle? It seems like it would only be able to get one gun on any bearing, with an especially wide gap off the port and starboard bow, so one gun shooting at the enemy at any time and a big arc where the enemy can't be shot. Seems a bit rubbish to me. Well, you do have to remember what this ship was designed to actually fight in, specifically the American Civil War. So she was designed, as well as to fight Union ironclads, to just generally break the blockade. And in that respect, she's heavily armoured enough to basically shrug off anything that the wooden Union ships can throw at her. And bear in mind, wooden ships were still the vast majority of the Union blockade forces. And at that point, the fact that she has fewer but larger guns is probably fine, because the big guns can demolish a lot of frigates and paddle steamers and other smaller ships, which again make up the bulk of the Union forces, in relatively short order. Plus, of course, she is a ram, and she's actually purposely designed for that. So her tactics wouldn't just be to shoot up the opponent. Her tactics would be to use the guns to hopefully damage, cripple, or destroy an opponent, but they are, in a sense, almost secondary to the fact that she's supposed to be running in and just physically smashing up her opponents directly, straight to the face. So in that respect, whilst she sort of existed this liminal space, because whilst her armour is designed to protect her against 15-inch Dahlgrens, which would mean that at the time of launch she'd be relatively safe from quite a lot of different ironclads out there. As you said, her firepower is not the greatest, so a lot of it would come down to whether or not she's fast enough and manoeuvrable enough to close down for a ram before her upper works are reduced, funnel shot away, mast shot away, etc., by the opponent vessel. So, for example, if she was going to try and take on something like Warrior or Black Prince, despite the fact that those ships are older than she is, and she'd still be a little bit up the creek without a paddle, because both Warrior and Black Prince are capable of just keeping away from her. They can basically kite her all day. They have similar levels of protection on the belt, and eventually a warrior type ironclad with the 64 pounders can probably get just about the bearing to get a shot through. Bearing in mind that Warrior's guns were, on a good day with the right ammunition and gunpowder, capable of just about defeating 4.5 inches of armour. Conversely, if the Stonewall or Kotetsu, or whatever name she happens to be going under this particular month, runs into a vessel that is smaller and less agile than her, like, say, the majority of Union monitors, then she could potentially defeat them, relatively speaking, easily, because even if her guns don't work particularly well against the monitors, while the monitors' guns, in theory, don't work particularly well against her either, but if she's faster and more manoeuvrable than the monitor, then she can close it down and ram it, at which point her design means that would almost certainly have a lethal effect. The US monitors in the American Civil War were many things, but capable of resisting large-scale flooding events for more than a few minutes, they were not. So, yeah, it kind of depends very much on what her opponent is, considerably more than perhaps other ironclads where you might just be thinking about a straight-up gunfight. John Fisher asks, has there ever been any definitive and reliable source listing why Bismarck's main guns knocked out its own radar and why this was not detected prior to her sailing? There's a number of reliable sources that have advocated theories as to what exactly was the problem. The issue is, if you're trying to be definitive, it's kind of like the arguments you see about, what is the definitive way in which Hood exploded. You can come up with a very convincing argument that accounts for pretty much all of the factors, but at the end of the day, you cannot 100% for certain prove X, Y, or Z, because in Hood's case, because she's blown into a billion pieces and nobody who was even close to the vicinity of the actual explosion survived to tell us what happened. And it's not the era of zoom in 4K footage, so there's no external video that's worth anything for the examination either. And similarly with Bismarck's radar, almost everybody involved with handling it died, the ship itself sank, and there's no point in examining the ship's radar now because, well, for one thing, it's been on the seabed for 80 years, and for another thing, the final battle, the British did have a little bit to say about rearranging the upper works of Bismarck. So I suspect that any damage that's there now is more than likely the result of that battle. So we can look at what we've got and we can come up with ideas as to why. Now, there are 2 or 3 major competing factors which could explain why, and it may be a combination of all of the above, or it could be one or the other. But anyway, so one potential issue could be the fact that in tests, perhaps when Bismarck was doing her gunnery tests, maybe they didn't fire full power salvos in maybe they did them in a broadside manner, but maybe they didn't do them with the turrets racked all the way back, the front turrets racked all the way back to their sort of almost over the shoulder shooting potential. And if you've seen the blast wave pressure charts that I've put up at various points, you'll know that if the ship had its guns aimed 90 degrees perpendicular, then the blast effects on the superstructure are going to be considerably different to if those guns have racked around almost to their stops and they're now firing. So it could just simply be an overpressure that they hadn't accounted for in initial testing because, they didn't fire the guns at that particular angle. You see the same kind of thing, with South Dakota's various failing electronics at Guadalcanal because it encountered things that hadn't come up in testing. But there's also the fact that Bismarck had, apparently, as far as anyone can tell, was carrying old vacuum tube transistors for her radar, which were of an older and much more shock vulnerable type as compared to the next model, which was introduced on ships like Tirpitz, and therefore just, they might resist the shock of gun firing fine once or twice. So that in the shakedown trials, nothing odd might come up, but they have a very short life when they're subjected to repeated shock. So then if Bismarck goes into, full bore action pelting away, not only have those components have their life reduced by the previous shocks of the testing, but now they're being subjected to an awful lot more shocks. They break and radar goes down. And I've just remembered it's not transistors, it's triodes. Triodes are the vulnerable component in the radar setup. Basically, Bismarck went to sea with one of the last models of a first generation SeaTac radar, which was difficult to repair at sea and had vulnerable triodes, whereas other ships, including, ironically enough, Prince Eugen, went to sea with a second generation version that had far more damage resistant triodes. And radar packing up wasn't just a Bismarck unique problem. It did happen on other ships in other navies at other times due to various issues, but I suspect that it's probably a combination of the two. I think Bismarck has been installed with this slightly older radar. It's basically the last, practically speaking, the last one off the production line with these older components. And then when they've taken it out to sea in trials, they probably didn't subject it to exactly the gun firing angles that would cause an issue, and then when they went into combat, turns out doing over the shoulder shots with the forward turrets did cause a problem, and then they had a difficult to repair radar, which they then took a while, depending on the reports, either took a long time to repair or failed to repair at all. Wienve asks, there are photographs where wartime censors have removed radars from World War II US Navy warships. Are there any other examples of censors removing a specific weapon system but have still allowed the picture to be published? The main targets of censors generally seem to be electronic systems, so radar, communications equipment, anti-missile jamming equipment, etc., as you can see in this photo of King George V. But in terms of weapon systems themselves, I can't recall seeing much. I vaguely recall at one point seeing a photograph where the unrotated projectile launchers had been censored out for some reason. Not that, hiding knowledge of those things would have helped anybody because they're pretty useless, but never mind. I can't remember seeing sort of censored torpedo launchers, secondary guns or primary guns, because they're all pretty well known. A few of the more esoteric things like the UP launchers, yes, but generally speaking, almost all the sense marks I've seen on warships tend to be associated with some form of electronic system rather than the main part of the ship itself or its armament. But of course, if people know of examples where they have censored out part of the ship's armament, then please feel free to chime in with a link or something in the comments below. Commander Hamfisted asks, how effective would 16-inch HESH be against a given capital ship in, say, 1942? Against capital ships, i.e. battleships, battlecruisers, not particularly effective at all. But to be perfectly honest, yeah, sure, it'll cause a lot of spalling damage, but splinter damage from bits spalled off the interior, which is what HESH rounds do to things, is exactly what the secondary defences of battleships are designed to protect against, whether that be through wooden backing to the armour belt itself, or armoured bulkheads and secondary armoured decks to catch spall and splintering. There are pre-built defences into pretty much all capital ships of this period that will defeat that kind of attack pretty easily. Admittedly, if you hit it with a really big HESH round like a 16-inch, you might project some really nice big splinters at a fairly high speed to the point they might defeat some of that interior protection, but it's not gonna likely do a tremendous amount. I mean, it's possible that it would then carry on through bulkheads and or decks and might hit something vital, but at that point it's still just an inert chunk of somewhat hot metal travelling at speed, which I know that sounds like it might be pretty dangerous. Indeed it would be if you stood in the way, but in terms of the overall volume of a battleship, it's not actually too much of a problem. There's splinters all over ships, and they don't usually do too much, to the point that when they do actually do anything significant, it becomes of note. Whereas a 16-inch AP shell will just, travel to pretty much the same point, if not further, and then detonate, at which point it's going to do a heck of a lot more damage. If you're going to use some kind of 16-inch HESH round, probably your best bet for the ship it's going to have the most effect on is going to be destroyers, because a 16-inch AP, as USS Johnston and others proved, will just go straight through and out the other side. A 16-inch HESH smashing up against a destroyer might actually do more damage to the interior of a destroyer than the AP round would, but at that point you might as well just use an HE round. Packer 910 asks, I never thought much about Japanese return fire during island bombardment, but recently I discovered that USS California was hit by 22 6-inch shells off of Tinian. Were any other ships hit this extensively by shore batteries during World War II? I believe you're actually referring to USS Colorado, but yes, that she was hit by 22 6-inch shells off of Tinian. Here she is with various dents and holes in her thereafter. Now, as far as I'm aware, Colorado was the most hit ship during the Pacific Campaign by Japanese shore batteries, but she certainly wasn't the only one. In fact, one of the destroyers that came in to assist her and draw off enemy fire whilst she was in the process of withdrawing was itself hit 6 times, probably by the same shore battery. And other US ships, destroyers, landing craft, cruisers, etc., and the occasional battleship would be hit by coastal batteries as well. Now, as I say, they weren't hit quite as much as Colorado, at least as far as I'm aware, but when it comes to effect, some of the other ships were more badly affected, because obviously if you start hitting cruisers or destroyers with 6-inch shells, that can have a considerably worse effect on their ability to keep station and maybe even their ability to stay afloat than a larger number of 6-inch shells would have on something like a battleship. So yeah, extensively in terms of sheer numbers of hits, no. Extensively as in effect on the ship, yeah, some of the smaller ones were outright knocked out or destroyed. Nicholas Rassar asks, US cruisers have a centerline 5-inch turret fore and aft to keep an 8-gun secondary broadside, despite only having 6 turrets. Were there any plans to use this arrangement or a similar arrangement on US battleships to either increase efficiency or increase broadside firepower for the same number of turrets, and if not, why not? So no, there weren't any plans to have this kind of thing on US battleships, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, cruisers normally have a very high length to beam ratio, they're very, very long and quite slim, which means that even on a big cruiser, like the Des Moines, which you can see here, well, this is actually Salem, a Des Moines class cruiser, there isn't the room on the sides for the double stack, double depth turret arrangement that you could get on some of the larger US battleships like the Iowa or the Montanas as planned. So that restricted how many guns you could get down the sides. So in order to get a decent AA broadside quite efficiently, you had to find somewhere else to put them. And, as you said, fore and aft, that allows the gun to bear in either direction, which effectively adds a turret to either side as an option, whilst only actually having to use the one. And also, as I said, because it's got this great length, there's also a lot more space on the centerline proportionally. Additionally, the turrets, even though they're quite large, an 8-inch turret weighs considerably less and has considerably smaller dimensions in all respects than a 16-inch turret. And so the effect on stability of putting a 5-inch twin mount above a pair of super-firing 8-inch turrets is not too great, whereas the effect on stability of putting a 5-inch 38 mount behind a pair of 16-inch turrets, which are going to be somewhat taller, is going to be more because it's higher up, and battleships, which tend to be wider for a given beam, and obviously they have these massive great gun turrets on the centerline, tend to have considerably more space available on the beam than they do on the direct amidships fore to aft line. So basically with battleships there's a lot more space available on the sides, a lot less space available on the centerline, and it's the other way around on cruisers, apart from the stability issues and so forth. So for US battleships it made a lot more sense, and for pretty much almost anybody else's battleships, made a lot more sense to have secondary batteries mounted port and starboard, and then that allows you to close up your main battery as close as possible in order to get a smaller citadel, which means you can have increased armour, because the side-mounted secondary guns are basically going to be abreast of the machinery spaces anyway. The only World War II capital ship that kind of breaks this rule is the Yamato class, which of course had centerline 666 turrets, but to be honest that wasn't exactly the world's best design decision in my opinion anyway, so yeah, whatever. Bill Luster asks, modern warships seem more and more designed to serve for decades, i.e. accept future upgrades that haven't been invented yet, have their propulsion systems replaced or refueled mid-life, or they leave blocks of weight and space unused. Aside from the Scharnhorst, were any Dreadnought-era ships also designed for the period equivalent? Several had later upgrades to armour, replaced propulsion, guns, etc., but it seems to have been done on an ad hoc basis rather than planned. Could a treaty-era ship like Hood or Nagato be designed with a core engine section intended for easier replacement when the boilers needed replacing in 10 to 20 years? And would someone like Jackie Fisher expect his ship to serve long enough for that to matter? In theory, yes, and some ships did have sections that were easier to remove in order to replace major components. US standard types, for example, especially the turboelectric drive set ones, had sections of deck plating which were designed to be removed to allow for easier servicing / replacement. However, whilst there are a few other ships that are designed to receive upgrades, the Megamis for instance, I continue to maintain that someone designed the Counties for but not with full belt armour when they were originally built, and so on. The idea, generally speaking, of designing a ship so that you could easily replace major components of it wasn't really a thing back then, because, well, in the age of sail, replacing or upgrading a ship was relatively easy. If you wanted to change the sail out, for instance, yes, you'd have to re-rig the ship, and that would be a pain, but you could do it. The systems were out in the open. And if you wanted to re-gun a ship, again, you had hatches that were designed to take the armament in and out anyway, so as long as the armament fitted in those hatches and didn't fall through the deck when it was positioned at a gun port, then fine, no problem. Once you got into ships where this was becoming harder and harder, i.e. ironclads and then compound armoured ships, pre-dreadnoughts, and then into the 20th century, the problem was that the systems in question were getting heavier and heavier, so they were harder to move. They're also getting much, much harder to access. So, guns were pretty much the one thing that remained relatively easy to remove because of the fact you occasionally had to swap out the barrels. But engines, multiple decks down, behind armour and below armour and below superstructure and so forth. And that did make it very difficult to upgrade, combined with the fact that pretty much from the starting whistle of the ironclad race, ships were no longer in service for 40, 50 years, the way they had been in the age of sail and in the way that some of them are these days. Okay, they might be kept notionally in service or in reserve for several decades, but ships were going from latest and greatest to par for the course to obsolete in 10 to 15 years. So there was no point in putting additional expense or design compromises in the ships to allow them to receive upgrades when the whole ship would probably no longer be a frontline unit within, you know, the time it took the average kid to go from birth to graduating from school. And this trend continued. It was only really artificially extended by the Washington Naval Treaty, because if it hadn't been for the Washington Naval Treaty, then, well, a lot of the stuff that got scrapped would have been likely scrapped anyway. But you know, there were ships that were retained briefly in the interwar period that, if newer ships had been being built to replace them, probably would have gone a lot earlier. The Iron Dukes, for example, wouldn't have been kept if the G3s and N3s had been built. Tiger either. You know, if you've got 3 tiers of shipping, i.e. 13.5 inch, 15 inch, and then the 16, 18 inch pairing of G3 and N3, it makes no sense to keep those smaller ships because they're basically obsolete. You can't rearm them and re-armor them and re-engine them in a way that makes them viable opponents against the latest and greatest. And whilst navies might be prepared to accept kind of a second tier of combatant for backing up the bigger ships and for using against smaller navies, third tier really was not a thing. Yeah, you did have third-class battleships in deep reserve and third-class cruisers, but generally speaking, both of those were rather broadly recognised to be a mistake the instant any kind of major hostilities broke out. So when you've got a typical assumed shelf life for a ship that's probably within the lifespan of its power plant, there's no point in making that power plant easily replaceable. And then it does lead to some of the increased costs in the 1930s and 1940s when people are looking now to modernise some of their old ships, and they realise, actually, you know, this ship is already 20 to 25 years old. We hadn't thought about this when it was being built. And the actual cost of going in and basically tearing half the ship apart to get down deep enough to fix all these issues is actually part of the driving force behind the massive modernizations, because, you know, if you've already taken off a good chunk of the superstructure and ripped up a good chunk of the deck and moved off half the secondary battery in order just to get at the engines, well, when you're putting it all back, you might as well put it back with something better and newer. Jonathan Smith asks, in World War I, I'm familiar with the gun monitors for shore bombardment, which had a relatively low-angle gun and relatively flat shell trajectory. Did anybody look at designing a World War I monitor around a large high-angle howitzer or mortar? Would a siege howitzer or mortar-based monitor have been useful at Gallipoli to drop high-angle fire on the Dardanelles forts from over the heights of the peninsula? Well, first off, extra points for letting me roll out this photo. This is one of the favourite photos I have in my collection of various British monitors off the coast of the English Channel. It is just a fantastic photo. Anyway, so it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that the gun monitors had a relatively flat shell trajectory. Some of them that used effectively recycled guns and turrets, okay, yeah, a few of them had a somewhat restricted trajectory, but even then a lot of them would receive increased elevation compared to the ships that the guns had been taken off of, and quite a number of monitors would be fitted with guns which had had considerable adaptation to allow for quite high angle fire, and then they would further modify that in a way that other battleships and so forth would imitate as well when they were in shore bombardment roles in World War II, which especially worked with the monitors, which would be to flood some of the anti-torpedo defences to give the ship an artificial list, which would then further increase the apparent angle of the guns. Now, granted, that's not as high angle as a mortar or siege howitzer, so yes, you could have a mortar or siege howitzer based monitor, but the main problem with those are that their range overall is relatively short, and if you have a very short range monitor, it stands a considerable risk of being hit and sunk by coastal defences, because monitors are not particularly well armoured. They're well protected against torpedoes, but against an enemy shore battery that starts hitting them repeatedly, they're not particularly fast, they're not particularly well protected, and that's one of the many reasons why they carry these bigger, heavier guns for the most part, certainly at least for their size, because there's a whole range of monitors from 6-inch guns to 9.2-inch guns, 12, 14, 15 and 18-inch. And the point is to try and outrange the enemy shore defences, or if they can't outrange them, at least be far enough away that they are a difficult target to hit, whereas a howitzer or a mortar with shorter range, it's going to get hit quite a bit. Now, yes, in theory, something with a very high angle of fire could hide behind terrain and drop fire on a target, like you suggested, the Dardanelles forts. However, that is such a niche scenario for something like World War I that they would have to have constructed monitors specifically for an engagement where they knew ahead of time that they would have this kind of solid cover to hide the monitor behind, which, is a little bit of a tall order for the most part. The other thing that you have to remember is that actually there were ships capable of doing that anyway. HMS Queen Elizabeth, for example, spent a while at the Gallipoli landings doing exactly that, firing its main guns over a headland that otherwise gave it cover into Ottoman positions. Now, granted, a high-angle gun like a monitor, like a siege howitzer or mortar, might have a slightly more circular rather than elliptical CEP, but again, it would have to be a very, very specialist ship, and by the time someone's looked at a situation, realised that this is even going to be a problem, because bear in mind, just because there's terrain cover in a particular area you're planning to land doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to need it. So once you've identified that A, this cover exists, B, that you actually need the cover to achieve your objectives, and C, you've then sent it all back home and told them, right, we need a ship that can do this, and then they've built it, the situation's probably over anyway. Texas and LaShock asks, following up on my question about the bombardment of Fort McHenry, you said the fuses for the bombs are ignited when they're fired. Yeah, usually. Occasionally there are designs where you light the fuse and then drop it in and then run away very fast, but usually it's lit by the powder charge. I started wondering how reliable that was. Were there occasions where the bomb would be fired but the fuse not lit? And who was responsible for determining where they wanted the bomb to detonate, calculating how long it would take the projectile to reach the position, determining how long the fuse needed to be, and then trimming it to that length? And what determines if you light the fuse and then launch it, or light it via firing? So generally, lighting it by launching it and using the charge to ignite it, or lighting it by literally just lighting the fuse, dropping it in the mortar and then firing it, basically comes down to the technology level. Lighting it by the charge igniting the fuse is by far the safer option, or rather than having to cut an additional length of fuse for an indeterminate amount of time between you lighting it, you shoving it down the barrel of the mortar, and then you firing the mortar. So yeah, that's definitely a thing. In terms of determining how long the fuse needs to be and trimming it to length, that would be the responsibility of the gun captain for the mortar. He'll usually have a table that will help him with that, but he'll also do it somewhat by eye, given his experience with fuses, because the fuses might burn at different rates depending on what situation they're in, weather-wise, temperature-wise, etc., etc. And also, obviously, whether or not you want it as an airburst, which generally you do, or whether you want it to burst lower down or after impact, which, it gets progressively more difficult to do and less likely the mortar round is going to survive. But to the other part of your question, if, were there occasions where the bombs would be fired but the fuse not lit? Yeah, quite a few. In any kind of significant bombardment where you had several hundred to several thousand mortar rounds being fired, there would be a reasonable percentage of them which either the fuse went out, or the fuse was put out or failed in some way, shape or form, or the fuse just never ignited in the first place. Duds very much were a thing even back then, and indeed actually during the Crimean War, because basically, remember, early shells were basically the same as mortar rounds except fired straight at you for all intents and purposes. But in the Crimean War, at one point, whether it's a shell or a mortar round is not entirely clear, because they're basically both spheres with explosive in the middle and a fuse on one side. it landed aboard a Royal Navy ship of the line, and one of the first winners of the Victoria Cross got that award because he just picked up the thing despite the burning fuse and lobbed it over the side of the ship, where of course the seawater put the fuse out and the shell didn't explode, while everyone else was just running and looking for cover because they thought the thing was about to explode. The other thing that could be quite dangerous would be a partial fuse ignition. So if you fired the mortar bomb, but the fuse was smouldering perhaps instead of fully lit, it might go up in the air, come crashing down into whatever it is you fired it at, and then it might just sit there with the fuse quietly smouldering away. Everyone kind of thinks, oh yeah, it's a dud, ignore it. And then 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes later, then it explodes, and that could be quite dangerous, obviously, for the opponent, assuming, of course, it hasn't hit something really hard and smashed itself into a billion pieces. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. If you're listening to this on the weekend of the release, I am at the Steampunk Asylum in Lincoln. So in the slightly unlikely event that anyone who's there subscribes to this channel, hello. Otherwise, why not? Anyway, with that said, yeah, that's, I think, the only bit of channel admin for this week. Other than, well, it's now the end of August, so we're going into September, so let's see what that month brings. And I do need to catch up again on a Patreon live Drydock live stream from the beginning of the month, so apologies for that. Hopefully I will sort that out fairly soon.